Alright, I'm almost done with the world map. For real this time. Hopefully, it will be complete by the end of the month, and I can show it off for the November devlog, especially since many of the topics I plan to cover rely on it as a visual aid for the gameplay and system topics being discussed. But, since it is still unfinished, I decided to take a quick tangent this month and discuss some of the fluff of the story and world by introducing the nations in no particular order. Bear in mind that everything here is subject to change, and all of the visuals I'll be showing, for the most part, are just reference art to try to communicate the broad ideas of the different nations. Hopefully, if I don't show any particular image or group of images for more than a few seconds, I won't get copyright strikes. With all that said, let's get to know the nations of Lor Pikea. Octolia is a culture inspired largely by Renaissance Sicily, with a bit of this and that from Italian mafia mythos and a little bit of Romanization. It's a democratic republic, and the leader is a water elemental unit. The merchants of Octolia are world famous for their bartering skills, and they enjoy lives of luxury and abundance. The rest of the population, however, have generally low quality of life as they strive to meet the demands their nation puts on them. Octolia experienced a revolution around 20 years prior to the start of the story, and the people, largely funded by the aristocratic merchants, overthrew a monarch who is most well known for excessive taxes and brutal policing. Having suffered extensively at the hands of their previous rulers, the majority of the population have been largely tolerable of the current governance, despite its indifference to their well-being, if only because it is an improvement over active oppression. The elections held across the nation to select the head of state have resulted in the same charismatic leader being re-elected every 2 years, and the population often calls for her to take the mantle of president for life, which she regularly dismisses. The world at large is cautious and suspicious of Octolia's young government, and many believe the elections are heavily manipulated by those in power to present the illusion of choice to the population. Some whispered doubts that the deposed monarch freely passed his crest on to the leader of the revolution, who became the first and only elected president, but no method of taking a crest by force is currently known, so many dismiss the notion. The public trial and execution of the former king gives some credence to these whispers, as the crest would have prevented his death otherwise, but perhaps he accepted death rather than submitting to a lifetime of imprisonment. However, as is often the case, it is easy for idle minds to whisper of foul play. Macaron. Culture heavily inspired by the ancient Celts, while also leaning on fantasy tropes of druidic circles. It is a theocracy with a nature elemental leader. The spiritual leaders of Macaron, the circle, believe only by fully embracing the natural world and the flow of mana can universal peace be achieved. The circle do not force the people of the tribes to follow their every whim, but only those who are attuned to the natural world are granted a crest, and given any power to decide their own fate in an otherwise stoic and obedient society. All who are not part of the circle or a guardian granted a crest are expected to offer no dissidence as they toil and worship within strict guidelines. Any who actively seek to disrupt the tranquility, naturalism, or complete control the circle enforces within its borders are expelled with as much force as is necessary. Most of the world's nations look upon Macaron and see fanatics who make little sense, and the number of exiles the country pushes out doesn't help. The fact that almost all information about the nation and its inner workings are from those very exiles makes it somewhat suspect, but there is essentially no other source from which to learn about the circle or the population that follows it outside the borders of the nation. Since very few of Macaron's citizenry reside in towns and cities, the world as a whole is completely uncertain what size of population actually exists in the nation. Gentries. Culture heavily inspired by Arthurian legend, medieval France, and England. Monarchy with assembly of military leaders. It is headed by a fire elemental leader. While the monarch is the indisputable head of gentries, the nation's constitutional assembly carries much of the power. No birthright is required to become a leader, although the path to the assembly tends to be easier with a more noble birth. Propriety, ceremony, and duty completely dominate the hearts and minds of the people, and much is done in the name of justice and righteousness. This also applies to the methodology of governance within gentries. The monarch can suggest courses of action and policy, but at least 3/4 of the assembly must agree to put the policy in place, or at least 1/4 must veto an action or immediate direction for the nation to counter the monarch's will in a more pressing matter. Any suggestion to the monarch must be presented by at least 3 members of the assembly, and in order for the assembly to vote anything into law without the monarch's input, there must be unanimous agreement. The amount of support or opposition can be adjusted with either debate, compromise, or non-lethal duels, to force the issue. But the monarch selects much of the details of these combats to prevent a single member of the assembly from controlling the court. These duels do not have to be 1 against 1, and the monarch can use this power to influence situations. If, for example, a single member of the assembly opposes an otherwise unanimous law without royal input, the monarch can rely on that single knight winning a single battle against the weakest of the assembly to completely break the law's chances, or, if many are opposing a law the monarch is attempting to push through, a grand melee can be declared where all must fight and the victors determine the nation's course. The monarch always has the right to stand against a unanimous assembly themselves. If that does not stop the assembly's will on its own, the monarch can debate the issue until a duel is called for. At that point, as long as the monarch defeats a single member of the assembly, the law is prevented, until the next meeting of the assembly. Monarchs often, but are not required, to name one of the most powerful members of the assembly that have similar views to them, or at least declare similar views until they become the monarch, as their heir, and the designated heir often changes throughout a monarch's life. A final example of the principles at work in Gentries is the coronation of a new monarch, including an open invitation for challenge to their right to rule, with a full 2,000-page manuscript on how to handle challenges which, naturally, includes options for non-lethal combat to conclusively resolve many nuances of succession, with justice, honor, and righteousness determined by who wins, regardless of their actual morality. The rest of the world tends to listen when Gentris speaks, if only because it is common knowledge its population is always ready to support a noble war with the slightest justification. Gentris, on the other hand, rarely listens to anyone. Noema. Culture inspired by feudal Japan, but with the Empress actually being in military control as well. It is a theocratic imperial monarchy. The leader is light elemental. The Divine Empress rules absolutely over Noema, and the warlords governing each portion of the nation answer only to her. The Empress Bear is a legendary polearm and suit of armor said to have been created to fell the old gods and gain the freedom of humanity from the servitude of their creation. Honor is so overstressed in the culture that it is almost pervasive to the mindset of the people, and they constantly condemn the actions of all other nations when anything morally ambiguous happens, because they can so easily project their cultural beliefs upon any situation and take anything being valued above their views of honor as a mistake. This honor includes an extreme belief in the sanctity of family and familial bonds. Family is so incredibly important within Noema that to act against one's own flesh and blood is among the greatest dishonors and, as such, the greatest crimes. Further add to that the constant reinforcement among the populace that Noema is one greater family composed of citizen families, and you reach an entire population who fully adores their superhuman empress as a familial matron and would happily give their lives for her with fervor and adoration as they did. The majority of the nations largely dismiss the strong wording of Noema diplomacy as annoying lectures, but frequently, Noema and Gentris come to blows over their diplomatic exchanges. The other nations have largely learned that if one nods at a Noema diplomat with some degree of a serious expression, they tend to leave once they consider the recipient properly instructed in the ways of their dishonor. This doesn't tend to happen with Gentris, perhaps because the two nations' views on matters of morality and honor conflict so heavily, or perhaps because the last time Noema sent an unescorted diplomat to lecture Gentris, they had to be rescued by a military expedition as they were paraded around the foreign nation as a traveling demonstration of how crests allow even the most mortal wounds to be regenerated given enough time. The only reason Gentris and Noema are not perpetually at war is perhaps due to the Empress viewing conflict with other nations without an explicit and honorable purpose as a failure to the families of the empire that she views as her children. Ruthless. Culture inspired by the Persian Empire with some Greco-Roman adjustments. It's a decentralized bureaucracy funding a militaristic dictatorship. The leader is Darkness Elemental. Dictatorship with centralized military power, but decentralized leadership for all other forms of governance. Some of these regional leaders are democratically elected, others are themselves dictators. All that matters to the God King of Ruthless is that any revolution or rebellion not interfere with the flow of money, mana, and provisions to his military. The people and those who report to the God King on their behalf, whether with their blessings or not, know not to bother him with any inner turmoil. He does not exist to determine how the citizens of Ruthless will live their lives, but only to crush those from beyond the borders who would dare oppose them. Those in power of each province are granted no crest, and serving the God King directly by bearing his crest removes you from the civilian world in its entirety. It is common knowledge that the attempted use of a crest bearer or the monsters under their control against any citizen of Ruthless will bring the wrath of the God King, so it is surprisingly easy for the populace to remove someone they disapprove of from power, as the local military sits and watches. This does lead to a relatively high turnover of civilian leadership in most provinces, and instability in one portion of the nation or another is highly likely on any given day. The recipients of the God King's crest tend to be less combat savvy than the crest bearers of other nations, but summoners are often selected, and once they are granted a crest, they often have much greater control over monsters than the heroes of any other nation in the world. As such, Ruthless has a reputation for having larger and more powerful armies than the rest of the nations, but their leadership tends to be more easily focused down. Each province is completely self-contained when it comes to laws, customs, police forces, education, and the only unifying factor of the nation is its military and the meaningless border drawn on maps of the world. Truly, the madness, chaos, and turmoil within the politics of Ruthless make most outside its borders uncomfortable, much as does the indifference and dismissiveness the self-proclaimed God King shows to the world. Some whisper that he plays in secret by pulling strings in his own lands and beyond. Others are certain he legitimately does not care what happens to anyone else, so long as he has his mighty monsters to fly and march around on his whims. The only certainty a crest bearer from another nation has while looking upon Ruthless is that they are better off avoiding it. Civilians from other nations frequently trade and visit the nation, but it is also common knowledge that contracts bear no weight within its borders. That said, all visitors who run afoul of a provincial leader cannot rely on their home nation negotiating with Ruthless or the lunatic that calls himself God King, so they tend to be respectful during their stay. Kromgeld. Culture inspired by Viking clan society mixed with some federalism. It's a democratic meritocracy, and the leader exhibits a balance of elements. Those in power are responsible for the protection and well-being of those beneath them. As each clan is taken in from the wilds and welcomed into the gelding of Krom, the unifier, their banner has been added to his standard and their crest incorporated into his. With each clan that has joined, the strength coursing through the bodies of the nation's heroes has grown to be things of legend. The major crests that were united in the unification of Kromgeld, and the incredible level of attunement of the majority of Kromgeld's crest bearers, amplifies the personal empowerment of each minor crest to a much greater degree than any other nation. However, since each of the major crests combined were quite weak in comparison to the major crests at the head of each of the other nations of the world, Kromgeld is not known for the mightiest or most numerous monsters in their armies. While their heroes often grapple with their monsters in training, the amount of mana and crest power that results from the nation's heroes is quite low. That doesn't stop the pride or competition between the heroes of Kromgeld, or the admiration crest bearers are granted by the citizenry. That said, everyone in the nation knows that they are equals, and that, while a crest can be earned by anyone with strength of mind or body, having a crest granted to them does not make the crest bearer any more important than their friends or neighbors. Even the lowliest trapper or farmer is crucial to the continuation of society, and they have just as much voice in their governance as the son of Krom himself. It helps that all the tribes Krom united were of similar ancestry and culture, but who knows what would happen if people of different beliefs and views were to ever be drawn into the nation. The majority of the world is dismissive of Kromgeld, its inhabitants, and especially its crest bearers. While there have been previous incursions into the land of the savages, and many of the incursions have been repelled by the numerous and often powerful crest bearers, the relative lack of monstrous presence in Kromgeld's army has most nations of the world believing they could easily pluck the lands up if there were enough mana flowing through them to bother. Kromgeld is the only nation not sitting on the Council of Shared Prosperity, and rather than be indignant that seats are still granted despite Octolia's recent change of leadership, or ruthless, disregarding council decisions. The heroes of Cromgelt are instead thankful they don't need to toil with international niceties, when they can just hammer signs into the ground declaring, "Lands of Cromgelt, no trespassers," and kindly turn away any stranger that stumbles into their lands, pointing them back to the nearest civilization they seem to have gotten lost from. After the initial interaction with a smile on their face and an axe in their hand, the people of Cromgelt tend to treat respectful visitors well. Unfortunately, respectful visitors are quite rare. And those are the nations of Lor Pikea. Once Cuirass of Conquest is basically finished, they will be front and center for the story of the game. But again, the plan is to get the alpha out probably early 2024, get to open beta hopefully within a year or two after that, and then use the funding that I'm able to get from the early access, Kickstarter, or whatever other source of revenue I'm able to find to bring in some extra help to finalize the bits of the game as I work on implementing the story itself. And fingers crossed I'll have it done in another 5 or 6 years. But regardless, I'm in for the long haul, and every month I will continue putting out one of these devlogs talking about the game, and hopefully by the time it's ready, you'll have all reached the shut up and take my money point. But for now, that's been the devlog for Cuirass of Conquest for the month. I hope you enjoyed it, and until next time, have a good one.